The chamber was packed, every seat filled, every camera fixed on the woman at the center of it all. A hush swept across the room as Representative Jasmine Crockett leaned forward, her hands clasped, eyes sharp and unflinching. The opposing counsel had just finished a tirade, thinly veiled condescension wrapped in procedural language. But the real blow came in the form of a smirk. It wasn't just disrespect. It was the kind of smirk that said, "You don't belong here." Judge Allison Jones, presiding with her usual composed demeanor, tilted her head ever so slightly. She'd seen countless hearings, endless debates, but something about the electricity in this moment made her grip the gavel a little tighter. The room wasn't just waiting for Jasmine's reply, it was holding its breath. Then, in a voice that carried both steel and grace, Jasmine began. "You know," she said slowly, almost as if she were giving her opponent a final chance to rethink everything. "It's fascinating how some people confuse privilege with authority." The line cut through the air like a blade. Gasps rippled across the audience. The smirk faltered. Cameras zoomed in on faces. Shock, intrigue, discomfort. The tension wasn't manufactured. It was real, raw, and heavy. On social media, clips of the moment began circulating even before her sentence was finished. Tweets lit up. Jasmine Crockett just dropped a truth bomb on live TV. Did she just say that in a congressional hearing? The hashtag Crockett clapback started trending. But inside that chamber, Jasmine wasn't performing. She was defending. Every syllable carried the weight of those who had been dismissed, underestimated, or told to know their place. She leaned in closer, unafraid of the stares, unshaken by the power dynamics stacked against her. Judge Jones's eyebrows lifted, not in disapproval, but in genuine admiration. In that instant, she knew she was witnessing more than political theater. This was history. A woman refusing to shrink, a voice turning the tables. And just as the opponent began to stammer out a response, Jasmine raised her hand slightly, commanding silence, not with force, but with undeniable presence. The room froze. And what happened next would leave the entire nation in disbelief. Long before that electric moment in the chamber, the tension had been building like a storm no one wanted to acknowledge. Weeks of hearings had dragged on, each session more combative than the last. Policy debates had devolved into personal jabs. Lines meant to hold institutions together had blurred, replaced by a toxic mix of performative outrage and thinly disguised prejudice. At the center of it all stood Jasmine Crockett, a first-term representative who refused to play by the unspoken rules of knowing your place. Her rise had been swift and unapologetic. Born and raised in a working-class family, Jasmine had built her career on defending the underrepresented, not courting the powerful. And that made her dangerous to those who'd grown too comfortable controlling the narrative. The trigger came during a heated committee session on voting rights legislation. What was meant to be a procedural discussion turned into a stage for one particularly smug antagonist, a seasoned politician whose reputation thrived on dismissing progressive voices with well-practiced condescension. He questioned her credentials, mocked her tone, and implied, without ever saying it outright, that she didn't deserve her seat at the table. Americans across the country were watching. For many, this wasn't just about Jasmine Crockett. It was about them, immigrants who had worked twice as hard for half the recognition, women who had been talked over in boardrooms, young people told they were too emotional to lead. Jasmine represented a collective defiance, and her opponent represented a system that refused to make room. Judge Allison Jones, known for her poise and impartiality, had been following the hearings closely. She understood the stakes weren't merely political, they were cultural. The tone set in this chamber would ripple far beyond Capitol Hill. If Jasmine faltered, her opponent's sneering dismissal would be validated. But if she rose to the moment, millions would see themselves reflected in her strength.
News outlets began to circle like vultures sensing a spectacle. Headlines teased confrontation. Cable segments framed it as Crockett versus the establishment. Social media amplified every exchange, every eye roll, every measured breath. Hashtags like #StandWithJasmine and Old Guard versus New Wave trended overnight. What made this different was the timing. America was at a cultural crossroads. Conversations about representation, race, gender, and power weren't simmering quietly, they were boiling over. This wasn't just another clash in Washington. It was a symbolic duel over who gets to define dignity and authority in the modern era. And Jasmine knew it. She wasn't naive about the weight on her shoulders. Behind closed doors, allies had warned her, "They'll try to provoke you. Stay calm. Don't give them what they want." But Jasmine had a different philosophy. She didn't believe in shrinking herself to fit a mold someone else had built. As the day of the confrontation approached, whispers filled the halls. Aides exchanged nervous glances. Veteran reporters cleared their schedules. Something big was coming. Everyone felt it. When the gavel struck that morning, the chamber wasn't just filled with lawmakers. It was filled with history waiting to happen. Jasmine took her seat, back straight, eyes steady. Her opponent adjusted his tie, wearing the same smug grin that would soon vanish. Judge Jones surveyed the room, sensing the gravity. The first few exchanges were restrained, probing questions, procedural remarks. But beneath the surface, the current was shifting. Her opponent leaned in, ready to pounce. He underestimated her resolve. And as his carefully rehearsed attack began to unfold, one thing became clear. This wasn't going to be a polite disagreement. It was about to erupt into a battle that would shake the chamber and the nation to its core. What Jasmine did next would ignite the most unforgettable escalation of her career.
Long before the cameras turned toward this pivotal hearing, the man sitting opposite Jasmine Crockett had crafted a career on one thing above all else: control. Representative Thomas Whitaker wasn't just another politician. He was a seasoned tactician of the old guard, a man who thrived on the unspoken hierarchy of Washington. He believed power wasn't earned through moral clarity or public trust. It was inherited, guarded, and wielded like a weapon against anyone who dared challenge it. Whitaker had entered politics on a tide of family legacy. His father had held the same seat decades earlier. His uncle chaired influential committees, and his cousins were scattered throughout lobbying firms like chess pieces on a board he already owned. To him, Congress wasn't a public institution, it was an ancestral estate. And Jasmine Crockett, with her unapologetic tone and unpolished authenticity, was an intruder on sacred ground. Early in his career, Whitaker had learned the art of dressing hostility in polite language. In committee rooms, he'd raise an eyebrow instead of shouting, deliver cutting remarks wrapped in legislative jargon, and undermine opponents not through argument, but through demeanor. He didn't need to say, "You don't belong here." His pauses, smirks, and faintly amused chuckles said it for him. His arrogance wasn't confined to Capitol Hill. In private fundraisers, he was known for mocking younger progressives, calling them #politicians and speech makers without substance. At one closed-door donor event caught on a hot mic years earlier, he scoffed, "These kids think passion equals policy. It's cute." Until they realize this town eats idealists for breakfast. The clip resurfaced multiple times online, each time igniting outrage, but never sticking long enough to end his career. Whitaker always knew how to outlast the storm. But beneath the veneer of seasoned leadership was a pattern of hypocrisy that painted a far different picture than the one he projected. He publicly preached fiscal responsibility, yet he'd quietly secured millions in pork barrel spending for businesses owned by his closest allies. He positioned himself as a defender of traditional values, yet his voting record revealed selective outrage. Scandals involving his allies were dismissed as youthful mistakes, while minor missteps by opponents were amplified into moral crises. What made Whitaker especially dangerous was his knack for weaponizing respectability. He presented himself as the adult in the room, the voice of reason in an era of rising populism. But in reality, he used that image as a shield to launch attacks that were nothing but reasonable.
When women or people of color rose to challenge him, he didn't shout them down. He patronized them into silence. His confrontations followed a familiar pattern. First, established intellectual superiority through a barrage of statistics and legal references, some accurate, many cherry-picked. Second, interrupt subtly, under the guise of clarification. Third, deliver a smirk-laden closing line that made the opponent seem emotional or uninformed. It was a tactic honed over decades, designed to make challengers doubt themselves and the public question their competence. And for years, it worked. Journalists who pushed too hard found themselves iced out of his circles. Opponents who clashed with him were quietly isolated in committee negotiations. Even rising stars within his own party learned to tiptoe around him. Whitaker had built a fortress of influence, and within its walls, arrogance reigned. But times were changing. The new generation of lawmakers wasn't content to play by the old rules. Social media had shifted the battleground from closed committee rooms to the public arena. Microaggressions that once slipped unnoticed were now dissected frame by frame online. And Whitaker, for all his political cunning, underestimated how quickly the ground beneath him was shifting. His most recent controversy had already started to chip away at his carefully curated image. Months before the confrontation with Jasmine, leaked internal memos revealed that Whitaker's office had coordinated with outside interest groups to stall voting rights legislation, while publicly claiming to support fair access for all. The revelation triggered a media frenzy. While he managed to deflect immediate consequences with his usual charm, the trust cracks were visible. And when Jasmine Crockett entered the chamber, Whitaker saw not a colleague, but a threat. Her presence represented everything he had spent a career suppressing: authenticity over polish, conviction over calculation, representation over legacy. In strategy meetings, Whitaker was blunt. "She needs to be put in her place," he told his advisors. "We can't let the circus dictate policy." He came prepared with lines meant to rattle her, insinuations about her experience, veiled attacks on her tone, and even a few historical references meant to position himself as the learned statesman schooling an impulsive newcomer. But what he didn't realize was that his usual tactics wouldn't land the same way this time. The cameras weren't just on him. They were on millions of viewers ready to dissect every eyebrow raise, every condescending pause. His arrogance had always been his armor. But now, in this charged cultural moment, that same arrogance was about to become his downfall. He took his seat that day with the confidence of a man who believed the script would play out as it always had. But what he didn't know was that Jasmine Crockett wasn't just stepping into his arena. She was about to rewrite the entire playbook and expose the cracks in the empire he thought was unshakable. And the first blow would come sooner than he expected.
Jasmine Crockett's story did not begin in the marble halls of Congress or under the glare of national cameras. It began in a small, tight-knit neighborhood where everyone knew each other's names, where streets hummed with the sounds of children playing, and where dreams often felt bigger than the opportunities available. Born to immigrant parents who arrived in America with nothing but hope and relentless work ethic, Jasmine learned early the meaning of sacrifice and perseverance. Her father worked long nights in a factory. Her mother balanced multiple jobs to keep the family afloat, and both instilled in her a quiet but unwavering belief: dignity is earned, not by inheritance, but by action. From her earliest years, Jasmine exhibited a curiosity and fearlessness that set her apart. While other children played safely in the backyard, she was often poring over newspapers, memorizing speeches by leaders, and asking difficult questions that adults sometimes struggled to answer. Her teachers recognized her brilliance, but also warned that her assertiveness could be misunderstood. In classrooms and community centers alike, Jasmine learned a critical lesson early on: voice is power, but speaking it comes at a cost. Her adolescence was marked by moments that would forge her resilience. At 15, she witnessed a local election where systemic inequities left families like hers marginalized and voiceless. She saw candidates dismiss the concerns of her neighbors with polished smiles and rehearsed talking points. It was in that crucible of frustration and awakening that Jasmine resolved she would not simply be a bystander to injustice. She would become a participant, a defender, a voice for those told their opinions didn't matter. Academia became her battleground. Jasmine excelled, but success never shielded her from the subtle and overt biases that marked her path. Professors questioned her methods, peers doubted her capability, and in student government meetings, she often found her contributions minimized. Each instance of dismissal, however, only strengthened her conviction. She realized early on that obstacles could either silence or galvanize, and she chose the latter. After college, Jasmine entered the legal world, specializing in civil rights and advocacy. She represented communities that had long been ignored, fighting not only in courtrooms, but in public forums, town halls, and legislative meetings. Her cases were rarely simple, and victories were hard-won, but she carried each challenge with integrity. Clients didn't just see a lawyer. They saw someone who mirrored their struggles, someone who refused to let injustice stand unchallenged. Her reputation grew not because she sought fame, but because her work resonated. When legislative injustices arose, voter suppression bills, discriminatory housing policies, and equitable education funding, Jasmine stood on the front lines. Her arguments were meticulous, her voice calm yet commanding, and her presence impossible to ignore. Opponents often underestimated her, assuming that her youth or her commitment to principle would make her pliable. Time and time again, she proved them wrong. Jasmine's philosophy of leadership was deeply rooted in her upbringing. She believed in the dignity of service over self, in truth over convenience, and in standing for the voiceless rather than pandering to the powerful. Her moral compass was sharpened by first-hand experience. She had seen the consequences of silence, and she refused to replicate them. This ethical clarity became her most formidable asset, particularly when navigating a political landscape that rewarded spectacle over substance. Yet it was not only her past struggles that prepared her for the moment with Thomas Whitaker. It was the sum of her experiences. The nights spent researching policy while working double shifts, the time she had faced condescension in courtrooms and boardrooms, the whispered doubts of well-meaning mentors who warned her that the system wasn't ready for someone like her. Each obstacle had been a rehearsal, each challenge a lesson in poise, strategy, and resilience. Jasmine had also cultivated a unique ability to read people. Years of navigating adversarial spaces had honed her perception. She could detect not just what someone was saying, but the intentions behind it. She understood the theater of power, the smirks, the pauses, the carefully timed interruptions. Unlike many who floundered under scrutiny, she could maintain composure, anticipate the moves of others, and respond with precision. Her personal life reinforced these qualities. Friends and family described her as fiercely loyal, compassionate, and courageous. She had learned empathy through hardship and celebrated success with humility. These qualities grounded her in moments of pressure, reminding her that every action was not just about winning a debate or a vote, but about setting an example for a broader community who had long been denied a platform. By the time Jasmine took her seat in that fateful hearing, she was more than ready. She carried with her not just knowledge of the law or legislative procedure, but a lifetime of preparation in resilience, strategy, and moral courage. Every lesson from her upbringing, every challenge faced in her career, every whispered doubt she had silenced within herself had converged into this single moment. And while the opponent sitting across from her relied on inherited authority, practiced arrogance, and superficial charm, Jasmine embodied the power of earned respect, preparation, and conviction. The chamber might have appeared evenly balanced on paper, but the invisible scales of readiness and moral clarity were tipping decisively in her favor. As the first words of the exchange hung in the air, one thing was already clear. This was not just a hearing, it was a reckoning, and Jasmine Crockett was uniquely equipped to turn the tide, not just for herself, but for every voice that had been told it didn't belong. The tension in the room thickened. Every eye was fixed, every breath measured, every mind anticipating the moment when courage would meet arrogance head-on. And what Jasmine was about to unleash would not just challenge her opponent, it would redefine the rules of engagement entirely.
The room, once filled with cautious murmurs and polite nods, had transformed into a crucible of tension. Jasmine Crockett sat with her back straight, eyes unwavering, as Thomas Whitaker leaned forward, his smirk sharpened, ready to strike. He began with a calculated remark, a subtle jab disguised as a question about procedure, intended to unsettle her, to make her appear flustered in front of judges, colleagues, and the nation watching. "Representative Crockett," he began, voice measured but laced with condescension, "your proposals are ambitious, but I wonder whether your experience truly prepares you for the complexities of this legislation." A ripple passed through the room. The comment was deliberate, meant to challenge her credibility. Whitaker's gaze lingered, half smile in place, anticipating her hesitation, a pause he assumed she could not sustain. But Jasmine didn't blink. She let the words hang in the air, giving him just enough space to feel confident. Then she spoke, her tone calm but unyielding. "Ambition is not a flaw, Mr. Whitaker. It is the engine of progress. And experience is not measured in years at the podium, but in the courage to confront injustice when it appears." The chamber went silent. Cameras zoomed in, capturing the subtle falter in Whitaker's expression. For the first time, his smirk wavered. He opened his mouth to reply, only to be cut off by the weight of Jasmine's presence. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't shout. She simply spoke truth with precision, forcing him to scramble for a counter-narrative. Whitaker shifted tactics, his voice sharpening. He began citing statistics, reports, and procedural loopholes, each reference carefully selected to undermine her points. But Jasmine, prepared and unflinching, dissected each argument with surgical clarity. Where he sought confusion, she offered lucidity. Where he saw doubt, she offered evidence. The audience began leaning forward, caught in the clash of intellect and principle. "You speak of fairness, yet the policies you defend have systematically excluded communities who are already marginalized. Authority without justice is not leadership. It is tyranny." Her words hit like a thunderclap. A few colleagues whispered, some eyes widened, and cameras captured the moment the balance of power subtly shifted. Whitaker's practiced composure began to crack. His rebuttals grew shorter, sharper, more defensive. He attempted sarcasm, a last-ditch effort to regain control, but the effect was immediate. His tone, once commanding, now sounded strained, even petty. The tension escalated further when a procedural technicality arose mid-discussion. Whitaker pounced, hoping to trap her in a misstep. He leaned into the microphone, his voice slick with confidence. "Perhaps a quick review of the rules will remind us who truly understands this process." Jasmine's eyes never left him. She replied evenly, "Understanding rules is meaningless without understanding people. And understanding people requires empathy, a skill you might have overlooked in your decades here." A murmur ran through the room. The line was sharp, undeniable. The dynamic had flipped. Where Whitaker had assumed dominance, he now faced scrutiny amplified by truth. His earlier arrogance, his practiced gestures, and his smirks began to feel hollow. Every pause, every defensive glance was magnified by the cameras and the watching audience. Even Judge Allison Jones leaned forward slightly, her measured gaze acknowledging the intellectual battle before her. She had seen many heated exchanges, but there was a rhythm here, a balance of poise, preparation, and principle that set Jasmine apart. The crowd outside the chamber, following live feeds, could almost sense the shifting tide. Social media had already begun buzzing. Pundits were typing furiously, trying to capture the first hints of a turning point. As the debate intensified, the personal undertones became unavoidable. Whitaker's subtle digs, once veiled as procedural critique, now rang hollow against Jasmine's clarity and moral authority. Every attempt to belittle her was met with calm, piercing rebuttals that exposed both his hypocrisy and his growing frustration. By now the atmosphere was taut, like a wire stretched to its limit. Each word carried weight, each gesture implied consequence, and as Whitaker's defenses grew visibly brittle, the audience realized something monumental was unfolding. This was not merely a debate about legislation. It was a clash of eras, of philosophies, and of courage versus complacency. The stage was set. The confrontation had reached a point of no return. Every eye was on Jasmine Crockett, every ear strained for her next move, and in the heavy silence that followed her latest rebuttal, one thing was certain: the moment was building toward a climax that no one, least of all Whitaker, would soon forget.
The chamber seemed to hold its breath. After minutes of escalating tension, Jasmine Crockett leaned forward, her hands resting lightly on the polished desk, eyes scanning the room with quiet intensity. Every motion was deliberate, every pause calculated. Thomas Whitaker, who had spent decades mastering the art of condescension, felt a subtle shift in the air, a vibration he couldn't control, a current that hinted he was no longer leading the dance. He opened his mouth, ready to strike back, but Jasmine raised a finger slightly, not to silence him aggressively, but to signal that this time she would set the rhythm. The room fell silent. Even the usual murmur of typing reporters paused. Cameras zoomed in, capturing her composure, the confidence in her stance, the calm before the storm. "You've spent your career mastering words," she began, her voice steady, resonant, and impossibly measured. "But mastery without conscience is nothing more than noise. Authority is not granted by tenure, nor respect earned by smirk or spectacle. True leadership," she continued, her gaze piercing Whitaker's, "is measured by how you lift those who have been pushed down, not how you keep them there." A quiet ripple of reaction passed through the chamber. Some lawmakers leaned forward, mouths slightly agape. Others exchanged glances, murmuring under their breaths. Social media feeds had already begun to explode in real time. Hashtags trended within seconds. Hashtag Crockett clapback. Hashtag leadership redefined. Hashtag mic drop moment. Analysts would later replay these first lines over and over, dissecting her poise, her words, the deliberate cadence of her delivery. Whitaker, momentarily stunned, tried to interject, but the interruption was unnecessary. Jasmine didn't merely block him with words, she dismantled his foundation entirely, exposing cracks no one had dared point out publicly. She recounted his selective record with precision, highlighting policies that had favored the privileged while marginalizing communities of color, citing statistics, reports, and public statements she could not refute. "And yet," she said, pausing just long enough for her words to echo, "you present yourself as the guardian of fairness. You speak of tradition and duty, but your actions betray a pattern of exclusion, systematic, deliberate, and unapologetic." The pause was electric. Even Whitaker's allies flinched. The condescension that had once been his shield now looked brittle, almost transparent. Cameras caught the slightest twitch at the corner of his mouth, a micro-expression betraying the first cracks in his armor. The room, packed with seasoned legislators, witnesses, and journalists, collectively leaned in. Jasmine didn't allow him a chance to recover. She moved seamlessly into her next point, recounting her own history, not as a boast, but as proof of preparation, empathy, and relentless commitment to service.
She spoke of nights spent fighting for the underrepresented, of clients ignored by the system, of countless moments when courage had been required over comfort. Every sentence landed like a measured blow, exposing the contrast between Whitaker's inherited authority and her earned respect. "You see," she continued, voice rising only slightly, "experience isn't measured in years sitting at a desk. Experience is measured by courage, integrity, and the ability to face power without fear, something you have never understood." At that moment, Whitaker's smirk had fully vanished. His hands gripped the desk beneath him, knuckles whitening. He opened his mouth to respond, but found his usual arsenal of rehearsed lines and subtle digs useless. Jasmine's narrative had reframed the conversation entirely. The audience was no longer watching a procedural debate. They were witnessing a reckoning. Her delivery was cinematic, almost ritualistic in its precision. She allowed pauses long enough for her words to sink in, letting the weight of each accusation, each revelation settle. When she recounted his involvement in stalling voting rights legislation while publicly advocating fairness, she didn't shout, she just stated the facts. But the silence that followed them spoke louder than any raised voice. Cameras captured Whitaker's subtle flinch, the faint tightening of his jaw, the avoidance of eye contact. A man suddenly exposed, no longer protected by his mastery of politeness and smirk. Jasmine's final lines were deliberate, poetic even, designed not merely to argue, but to assert moral dominance. "The truth," she said, leading slightly forward, eyes locking on his, "is that leadership demands accountability. And when accountability arrives, no amount of pretense or entitlement can withstand it. The people will always see what is authentic, and they will always remember who stood for justice when it mattered most." The words landed like a hammer striking an anvil. Whitaker's composure cracked visibly for the first time in decades. He stammered, searching for a counterattack that no longer existed. His voice, once commanding, faltered under the weight of undeniable truth. Colleagues shifted uncomfortably. Even longtime allies avoided his gaze. The chamber, usually a stage for controlled debate, felt alive with the electricity of revelation. Social media erupted. Clips of her remarks spread within seconds. Every pause, every gaze, every measured word dissected and replayed. Tweets multiplied in real time. "Did you see her? She just demolished him with facts and principle. This is what leadership looks like, unflinching, unshakable." The ripple effect extended beyond the political sphere. Activists, educators, and ordinary citizens felt validated, inspired, and emboldened. Judge Allison Jones, for the first time, allowed herself a small but unmistakable nod of approval. She recognized a rare alignment of intellect, courage, and moral clarity. The courtroom, once tense and uncertain, seemed to pivot entirely toward Jasmine's orbit. Every pause she allowed, every carefully chosen word was a drumbeat of inevitability. The old guard had underestimated her, and now the consequences were unavoidable. Whitaker's attempts to regain footing became increasingly desperate. His voice, sharp and defensive, lacked the finesse that had once masked arrogance as wisdom. Every objection he raised was met with calm, precise dismantling. Audience members could sense the shift, the slow collapse of a figure who had relied for decades on intimidation and inherited power. By the time Jasmine concluded her rebuttal, the room had transformed. The chamber was no longer a neutral space. It was a stage on which courage, preparation, and moral authority had triumphed over entitlement and condescension. Whitaker, once the embodiment of control, sat visibly diminished. The smirk that defined his career was gone, replaced by tension, frustration, and the dawning realization that he had underestimated not just his opponent, but an entire movement she represented. And as Jasmine finally leaned back, letting silence fill the chamber, the message was clear. The confrontation was over, but the impact had only just begun. Every eye was on her, every mind reeling from the precision of her dismantling, every heart stirred by the undeniable force of integrity meeting arrogance. The nation had witnessed it, and in that charged silence, one truth resonated above all. History remembers those who rise with courage, not those who cling to power. And yet, as cameras captured the stunned reactions, whispers began to spread outside the chamber about the moments yet to unfold, the social ripple she had ignited, and the consequences that would continue long after Whitaker left the room.
The moment Jasmine Crockett leaned back, the chamber still vibrating with her words, the outside world had already erupted. Within seconds, clips of her rebuttal flooded social media feeds. Hashtags ignited like wildfire. Hashtag Crockett clapback. Hashtag truth over arrogance. Hashtag mic drop Crockett. Memes began to circulate immediately. Snapshots of her poised gaze paired with captions celebrating courage, integrity, and the quiet power of preparation. Across platforms, ordinary citizens and public figures alike shared the footage, each clip reinforcing the same sentiment. Something historic had just occurred. Twitter was ablaze. Accounts that rarely engaged in political discourse suddenly became conduits for admiration. One viral post read, "Jasmine Crockett just reminded the country what leadership really looks like. Facts, courage, integrity. The old guard didn't see her coming." Another featuring a split screen of Whitaker's faltering smirk and Jasmine's calm resolve went viral within minutes. This is what happens when preparation meets principle. Television pundits scrambled to contextualize the event. News channels played repeated slow-motion replays, highlighting the precision of her pauses, the clarity of her arguments, the intensity of her gaze. Political analysts debated in real time, noting how rare it was to see such a combination of moral authority and tactical brilliance. Even veteran journalists admitted that what they had witnessed defied the standard playbook of congressional hearings. The usual narratives of partisanship gave way to a broader conversation about ethics, courage, and accountability. Whitaker, for all his experience and political cunning, was caught flat-footed by the magnitude of the response. Journalists scrutinized his every gesture, past remarks resurfaced, and social media began to piece together a timeline of hypocrisy and privilege that now seemed almost cartoonish in contrast to Jasmine's composure. Every attempt to spin the encounter in his favor fell flat. The momentum had shifted decisively. Meanwhile, ordinary citizens, particularly those from communities long underrepresented in politics, felt a wave of validation. Immigrants, women, young progressives, and people of color tweeted their pride, shared stories of being underestimated or dismissed, and connected Jasmine's victory in the chamber to their own lived experiences. Civic forums filled with discussions about accountability, courage, and the power of voice. The debate was no longer confined to Washington. It had sparked a national dialogue about representation and the principles of justice and equity. Social media influencers amplified the moment further. Short clips and GIFs from the hearing were repurposed for viral engagement, some humorous, others serious, but all underlined the same truth. Jasmine had delivered more than a rebuttal. She had delivered a cultural reset. Memes celebrating her composure and intellect flooded Instagram, TikTok, and Facebook, transforming her words into rallying cries for those demanding systemic change. Even within the halls of Congress, the effects were palpable. Colleagues whispered in hallways, aides exchanged pointed glances, and committee members reconsidered the weight of their words. Whitaker's usual allies grew defensive, recognizing that the spectacle had shifted perception permanently. It was no longer a matter of protocol or procedure. The chamber had witnessed a moral reckoning that reverberated through the conscience of the institution itself. Media coverage quickly broadened beyond politics. Podcasts, opinion columns, and editorial boards dissected her strategy, her preparation, and the symbolism of the moment.
Headlines celebrated her triumph not just as a personal victory, but as a landmark moment for anyone who had ever been underestimated or dismissed. Terms like integrity versus entitlement and earned respect versus inherited authority dominated discourse. Public conversations increasingly framed the event as a defining clash of principles rather than just a legislative skirmish. International observers also took notice. Outlets in Europe, Asia, and Latin America covered the hearing, emphasizing Jasmine's clarity, courage, and moral authority. Social media posts highlighted her as an example of principled leadership and resilience in the face of systemic arrogance. In a world increasingly attuned to the narratives of inclusion and justice, her message resonated far beyond the borders of the United States. But it wasn't just the praise that mattered. It was the ripple effect. Community organizers reported increased engagement at town halls. Civic groups saw surges in volunteer participation, and young people inspired by Jasmine's example began to advocate more boldly for representation and equality. The confrontation had transformed from a single moment into a movement, demonstrating how one prepared, principled voice could catalyze a nationwide shift in awareness and empowerment. In the days that followed, commentary continued to mount. Panel discussions dissected every phrase, journalists compiled the most defining sound bites, and social media continued to generate a self-reinforcing cycle of admiration and debate. The narrative had crystallized. This was not just a politician excelling in debate. It was a demonstration of what courage, integrity, and meticulous preparation could accomplish against arrogance and entitlement. Even Whitaker could no longer control the story. Attempts at damage control were met with skepticism. Every prior claim, every subtle dig in previous hearings was re-examined and juxtaposed with Jasmine's unflinching moral clarity. His usual authority was undermined not by a single mistake, but by the undeniable contrast between a life spent cultivating privilege and a life spent earning respect. By the end of the week, the conversation had transcended the chamber entirely. Social media feeds were filled not just with clips, but with reflections, essays, and personal stories connecting Jasmine's words to broader societal truths. The public discourse had shifted. The debate had become a cultural touchstone. And while the moment had concluded inside the room, the impact was only beginning to unfold. The stage had been set for a transformation of perception, a reordering of respect, and a clear demonstration that courage and principle could not only survive in the face of arrogance, they could dominate, inspire, and ripple outward to change the national conversation entirely. And yet, even amid the flurry of praise and analysis, one question lingered in the collective consciousness. How would the opposition respond next, now that the balance had irrevocably shifted, and the nation's eyes were fully on Jasmine Crockett?
As the echoes of the debate faded, the chamber seemed to breathe again, but the energy Jasmine Crockett had unleashed lingered, tangible and transformative. She did not need to shout, nor did she need to revel in triumph. Instead, she allowed the weight of her words to settle, letting the moral clarity speak louder than any gesture, louder than any applause. This was the moment where confrontation became lesson, where conflict became illumination, and where personal victory became universal truth. Jasmine began to address the broader significance of what had just unfolded, speaking not to her opponent, nor even solely to the judges, but to every viewer, every listener, every citizen who had watched in disbelief and hope. What we witnessed here, she said, voice steady, is a reminder that integrity cannot be inherited and courage cannot be feigned. Leadership is not a matter of entitlement or title. It is a responsibility to act with fairness, with empathy, and with unwavering respect for every voice that has been silenced or dismissed. Her gaze swept across the chamber, capturing not only the attention of colleagues, but also the imagination of a nation. She reframed the conflict entirely,
This was no longer a story of political one-upmanship, no longer a debate of personality or ego. It was a story about dignity overcoming arrogance, principle triumphing over pretense, and the power of one prepared, determined individual to illuminate the path for millions. You don't have to hold power to exercise it responsibly. You don't have to inherit influence to wield it for justice. Each of us, in our own spaces, has the opportunity to stand for what is right, even when the odds seem insurmountable. That is the true measure of leadership. The emotional resonance was immediate. The chamber, long a theater of rigid protocol and rehearsed politeness, seemed transformed. Lawmakers shifted in their seats, aides whispered in quiet awe, and even the most skeptical observers felt the weight of her message. It was no longer just about a single hearing. It was about every citizen who had ever been underestimated, dismissed, or told their voice did not matter. Jasmine's words gave them permission to believe that courage and preparation could indeed move mountains. Social media, still buzzing with the fallout from the hearing, caught this new framing instantly. Posts multiplied, not just celebrating her rebuttal, but reflecting on her message. Courage isn't loud, it's steadfast. Leadership is earned, not inherited. Jasmine Crockett just reminded us all why truth matters. Communities, long marginalized, felt seen, heard, and validated. For many, it was a transformative moment, proof that principled action could challenge entrenched systems and inspire collective hope. Jasmine didn't stop there. She drew the connection between the microcosm of the chamber and the macrocosm of society. Our nation thrives when we lift each other up, when we speak for those who cannot speak for themselves, when we hold power accountable. Every small act of courage contributes to a larger movement of justice and dignity, and that movement does not wait for permission. It begins with each of us, today. The crescendo of her moral framing resonated, not because it was theatrical, but because it was authentic. It was the culmination of years of struggle, preparation, and lived experience, each word weighted with the certainty that she spoke not for herself, but for the people whose stories she carried with her. The contrast between her measured integrity and Whitaker's crumbling arrogance made the lesson unmistakable. The triumph of principle is not temporary. It leaves an enduring mark on conscience and culture alike. As the session concluded, the emotional payoff was clear. The nation had witnessed a moment that transcended politics. This was not just about a single hearing or a single representative. It was a reminder that anyone, regardless of background, birthright, or circumstance, could rise to confront injustice and inspire change. Jasmine Crockett had shown that leadership is defined not by who speaks the loudest, but by who stands steadfastly for what is right. And in that quiet, resounding truth, one could feel the heartbeat of a nation reminded of its better angels, the enduring lesson that courage, clarity, and conscience will always outlast arrogance, entitlement, and spectacle.
The echoes of that hearing continue to reverberate across the nation. Judge Allison Jones, visibly impressed, watched as Jasmine Crockett's words left not just Whitaker, but millions of Americans speechless. It wasn't just a rebuttal. It was a moment of clarity, courage, and undeniable integrity. A demonstration that standing firm in truth can topple arrogance and inspire a generation. As we reflect on this historic encounter, one thing is clear. Moments like these are not just about politics. They are about every individual who has ever been underestimated, dismissed, or told their voice doesn't matter. Jasmine's poise, preparation, and courage serve as a reminder that dignity and principle always carry weight, and that even in the face of overwhelming opposition, integrity has the power to redefine the conversation. This is why her response matters, not just in that chamber, but to millions of Americans watching from home. It is a testament to the power of perseverance, the importance of standing up for what is right, and the impact one voice can have when it is grounded in conviction and clarity. If you are inspired by Jasmine Crockett's example, don't let this moment end here. Share this video to remind others that courage and principle can triumph over arrogance. Subscribe to our channel to follow the stories of those who challenge the status quo.
Stand up for justice and inspire a nation. Because history isn't just written by those in power. It's written by those who dare to speak, to act, and to lead with integrity. And moments like Jasmine Crockett's remind us all, your voice matters, your courage matters, and together we can change the world. Be part of that change. Share this story. Join the conversation. Stand with truth.